She was 25 years old, and the world had made her an orphan twice over, first by taking her father, and then by taking his name. Emma Mercer stood on the dusty fringe of Fort Laramie, with nothing to her name but a set of mule harness he had prized, and $2 in her pocket. With that money, she bought a freight wagon so rotted and broken that no one else at the auction would even bid. But what nobody knew, what the wind and the high plains had kept secret for 3 long years, was that hidden beneath its warped floorboards was a truth that would change not only her life, but the memory of the man who had given it to her. Settle in and stay close as we tell this story of how a $2 wreck became a woman's vindication. Let us know where you're watching from tonight. Emma's life had been measured in the turning of wagon wheels and the steady, plodding gait of mules. Her father, John Mercer, was a freighter, a man whose reputation was as solid as the hickory axles he ran. He was not a man of grand pronouncements, but of quiet competence, and he had raised his daughter in his own image. While other girls learned needlepoint and the proper way to set a table, Emma learned the language of the trail. She learned the difference in the scent of rain on dust versus rain on pine, how to read the clouds for hail, and how to spot the subtle dip in the land that meant water might be found. Her mentor was her father, a man with hands calloused from leather reins and hot iron, but whose touch was always gentle when he showed her how to splice a rope or set a splint on a mule's leg. He taught her that a well-maintained wagon was a living thing, a partnership of wood and iron that you had to know intimately. "Listen to it, Em," he would say, his hand resting on a side panel. "It'll tell you what it needs. A loose bolt will chatter, a dry hub will groan. You just have to listen." Her world was the vast open country of the Wyoming Territory, the creak of leather, the jingle of trace chains, and the low, reassuring murmur of her father's voice against the endless wind. The beloved object of her childhood was not a doll, but a piece of his work. A small, perfectly tooled leather pouch he'd made for her to carry the fossils and strange rocks she found along the trail. He had died with it in his pocket, and it had not been returned to her. All she had left was his primary mule harness, the one he used for his lead mule, Belle. The brass buckles were heavy in her hands, the leather still holding the faint scent of his sweat and the oil he used to keep it supple. It was the last tangible piece of his skill, of his life's work. Their undoing had come not with a dramatic crash or a sudden illness, but with a piece of paper, an army contract to haul a payroll shipment from Cheyenne to Fort Fetterman, with a stop at Fort Laramie. It was the most lucrative contract John had ever secured, a testament to his years of reliability. He had checked every board, every spoke, every inch of canvas on his 2 Murphy wagons. Emma, then 22, had helped him, her eye as keen as his. The shipment was loaded under the watchful eye of a young, ambitious officer, Captain Thorne, and escorted by a small cavalry detail. But the wagons never reached Fort Fetterman. They were found weeks later, miles off the established trail near a place called Grayback Creek, splintered and empty. The mules were gone, the guards were dead, and the Army's payroll had vanished into the thin, cold air. John Mercer, who had been riding with the convoy, was the only survivor, found wandering and incoherent miles away. He could not explain what happened. He remembered a sudden storm, a confusing detour ordered by Thorne, a chaotic attack in the dark. But with the gold gone and the soldiers dead, the official inquiry found him negligent. His reputation, built over 30 years of honest work, crumbled into dust. No one would hire him. The shame settled on him like a shroud, and within 3 years it had taken him as surely as a bullet. He died quietly in a rented room, leaving Emma with his debts, his tarnished name, and the heavy brass and leather of a harness with no mule to wear it. The day after she buried her father in a plain pine box, Emma walked to the Mercer Freight and Haulage office, the business he had built from nothing. The sign was already painted over with a new name, Croft Overland. Inside, Silas Croft, a man who had once been her father's rival, sat behind her father's desk. He was a man with a soft body and hard eyes, and he did not stand when she entered. He looked at her with a kind of predatory pity that was worse than open contempt. He had bought out her father's assets to cover the last of the debts, he explained. The ledgers were all settled. There was a finality in his voice, a closing of a door she had once called home. "Your father was a good man once," Croft said. The words a small, cruel twist of the knife. A shame how it ended. He pushed a single piece of paper across the desk, a final accounting showing a balance of 0. She did not look at it. She did not argue or plead. Her father had taught her that dignity was something you carried inside, something no ledger could account for. Her eyes scanned the room, stripped of all the familiar things, the maps, the calendars, the worn chair where she used to sit. The only thing left that felt like him was the harness, coiled neatly on a peg by the door. It was his personal property, not a company asset. "That's mine," she said, her voice low and even. Croft gave a dismissive wave of his hand. "Take it. It's no use to me." Emma lifted the harness from the peg. The weight of it was both a burden and a comfort. She looped it over her shoulder, the brass buckles cool against her worn dress, and walked out of the office without a backward glance. She was ejected not with a shout, but with the quiet, administrative scratch of a pen, cast out into the indifferent dust of a town that had already forgotten her father's worth. She walked away from the freight yard, the heavy harness a counterweight to the hollowness in her chest. The sounds of Fort Laramie, once the familiar backdrop to her life, now seemed alien and hostile. The clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the shouts of teamsters maneuvering their long wagons, the sharp commands of a drill sergeant on the parade ground. It was a world she was no longer a part of. She was an outsider, the daughter of a man branded a failure. The weight on her shoulder was more than leather and brass. It was the entire physical memory of her father's labor. She could feel the worn spots where his hands had gripped it, the slight curve in the leather that had molded to the flank of his favorite mule. It was an anchor in the swirling uncertainty of her future. She made her way to the edge of the settlement where public auctions were held. It was a dusty, wind-scoured patch of ground where the army and local merchants disposed of surplus, damaged, or confiscated goods. A small crowd of men had gathered, scouts, out-of-work freighters, ranchers looking for a bargain. They were hard-bitten men who sized up every item with a practiced, cynical eye. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man with a stained vest, was working his way through a pile of army blankets, worn-out saddles, and barrels of salted fish. Emma stood at the back, a solitary figure in her plain dress, the harness coiled at her feet. She listened, her mind calculating, assessing. She had $2. It was not enough for a saddle, not enough for a decent tool. It was barely enough for a meal, but she had a different kind of hunger. She was looking for something to salvage, something to turn into a new beginning, however small. Finally, the auctioneer gestured to the last item, a wreck of a freight wagon that sat apart from the rest, listing sadly to one side like a beached whale. "All right, gentlemen, what am I bid for this piece of Wyoming history?" He called out, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Came in on a government seizure. Needs a little work." That was an understatement. The wagon was a ruin. One of its massive rear wheels had collapsed, the spokes splintered. The canvas top was shredded and green with moss. The oak sideboards were split and warped, bleached gray by years of sun and snow. The tongue was snapped clean off. The crowd was silent. A few men chuckled. No one made a move. This was not a bargain. It was a pile of firewood that you had to haul away yourself. "Do I hear $5? $3? $1 to take it off our hands?" The auctioneer pleaded. From the edge of the crowd, a man in buckskins watched Emma. He was lean and quiet, his face weathered by the sun. It was Peter Hollis, a scout for the fort. He knew wagons, and he knew this one's story. Emma took a breath. She saw past the rot. She saw seasoned hardwood that could be cut down for furniture or tool handles. She saw iron fittings that could be sold for scrap. She saw a chance. $2, she said, her voice clear and steady in the sudden quiet. The auctioneer's head snapped in her direction, his eyes wide with surprise. He looked at Emma, then at the wreck, then back at Emma. He shrugged. Sold. For $2 to the young lady with more optimism than sense. The gavel fell with a sharp crack. The men around her looked at her with a mixture of pity and amusement. As she stepped forward to hand over her 2 silver coins, Peter Hollis moved to her side. His voice was low, not unkind. "Ma'am," he said, his eyes on the broken wagon. "You should know. That wagon is from the Grayback Creek convoy, the one that vanished 3 years ago." His words hung in the air, a quiet warning. It was not just a wreck. It was a relic of the very disaster that had destroyed her father. Emma paid the clerk her $2, the last of her money, and received a hastily scribbled bill of sale. She was now the owner of a ghost. The crowd dispersed, leaving her alone with the derelict wagon under the vast, indifferent sky. She walked toward it, her steps slow and deliberate, the bill of sale clutched in her hand. Peter Hollis's warning echoed in her mind, but it did not deter her. If anything, it strengthened her resolve. This was a piece of her father's last journey. It was hers now. She began her inspection not with sentiment, but with the practical eye he had taught her. She circled the wagon, her hands running over the rough, weathered wood. The oak of the frame was still sound in places, protected by the overhang of the wagon bed. The sideboards were sun-bleached and splintered, but the wood was dense, old-growth timber, valuable in this tree-scarce land. She ran her fingers over the iron tires, pitted with rust but thick and heavy. The scrap value alone might be worth more than she'd paid. She ducked under the chassis, her eyes tracing the lines of the axles and the reach pole that connected them. The front axle was intact, but the rear one was cracked near the hub of the collapsed wheel. A difficult, but not impossible, repair for someone who knew how. Her father had taught her the art of shrinking a new tire onto a wheel, the magic of fire and water and brute force. The thought brought a sharp pang of grief, but she pushed it down. Grief was a luxury she could not afford. Her focus now was survival. She climbed into the wagon bed, her boots crunching on debris and dried leaves. The canvas top offered little protection, its tatters flapping in the wind like prayer flags. The floorboards were the worst of it. They were warped into gentle waves from seasons of snowmelt and sun, some of them soft and punky with rot. Her plan was to pry them up, salvage what she could, and use the solid frame and running gear as the basis for a small, functional cart she could pull herself, a way to haul goods or firewood and earn a few cents. She had her father's harness. Maybe she could even acquire a cheap donkey or an old mule. She began with the loosest boards at the back, using a small pry bar she carried in a leather roll with a few other essential tools. The nails screeched in protest as she worked them free. The wood was damp and smelled of earth and decay. It was slow, laborious work. As she moved forward, board by board, she noticed something odd. Near the front of the wagon bed, just behind where the driver's seat would have been, one board lay perfectly flat. It was not warped like its neighbors. Its color was a fraction darker, less bleached. She knelt, her fingers tracing its edges. And then she saw it, the faint, almost invisible marks of a chisel near the nail heads. These were not the original, hand-forged nails used by the wagon maker. These were newer, cruder. Someone had lifted this board and put it back. Her heart began to beat a little faster, a steady, heavy rhythm against her ribs. This was not rot. This was not damage. This was deliberate. Her breath caught in her throat. She paused, her hand resting on the flat, unassuming plank. The wind picked up, whistling through the tattered canvas, and for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath with her. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. "Listen to it, Em. It'll tell you what it needs." This wagon was telling her something. It was telling a story that had been silenced for 3 years. With renewed purpose, she set the tip of her pry bar into the thin seam at the edge of the board. She put her weight into it, leveraging the tool with a careful, steady pressure. The wood groaned, but it held fast. The nails were set deep. She repositioned the bar, working the other side, her knuckles scraping against the rough floor. Sweat beaded on her forehead, mingling with the dust. Finally, with a sharp, splintering crack, one end of the board lifted a few inches. A different smell rose from the opening, not the damp funk of decay, but the dry, dusty scent of a long enclosed space, with a faint, metallic tang. She worked her fingers under the edge and pulled. The board came free with a final shriek of tortured nails. Beneath it was not the solid timber of the wagon's underframing, but a shallow, neatly constructed compartment, about 3 feet long and 2 feet wide. It was a space hollowed out between the main floor and a false bottom. And it was not empty. The first thing she saw was a packet wrapped in oilcloth and tied securely with twine. It was surprisingly heavy. Her fingers trembled slightly as she lifted it out. The oilcloth was stiff and cracked with age, but it had done its job. She carefully untied the brittle twine and unfolded the wrapping. Inside was a stack of official-looking documents, their edges slightly yellowed, but the ink still dark and clear. They were Army dispatches, but tucked inside the fold of the top dispatch was a single, folded sheet of personal stationery. Beneath the packet, nestled in the dark recess, was a rusted iron strongbox, the kind used for valuables and payrolls. It was small but heavy, its surface pitted and stained. It was locked. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This was it. This had to be it. She set the strongbox aside and turned her attention to the letter. She unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was neat, precise, the script of an educated man. It was dated just a few days after her father's convoy had disappeared. It read, "To whoever finds this, my name is Corporal Elias Vance. I was an escort for the Fetterman payroll. I am writing this in what I know are my final hours. We were not attacked by road agents. The ambush was a lie, orchestrated by our commander, Captain Thorne, and a civilian contractor named Silas Croft. They planned to steal the payroll and blame the freighter, John Mercer, a man whose only crime was his trust. The attack was staged by men hired by Croft. I was shot not by an outlaw, but by my own captain when I refused to go along with the murder of the other guards. I have been left for dead, but I managed to crawl back to this wagon. I have hidden the proof here. The strongbox contains the true payroll ledger signed by Thorne before we left, and a second, forged ledger created to frame Mercer. The key to the box is taped to the back of this letter. The dispatches prove Thorne ordered the convoy off the main trail against regulations. Take this to the commander at Fort Laramie. Do not trust anyone else. John Mercer is an innocent man. Do not let them bury his name with my body. God grant you the courage to see justice done." Emma's hands were shaking as she finished reading. A cold, clarifying anger washed over her, so pure and sharp it burned away her grief. Silas Croft. Captain Thorne. It all made sense. The new sign on her father's office, the captain's quick rise in reputation, her father's confused and broken testimony. She turned the letter over. Taped to the back with a strip of discolored cloth tape was a small, ornate brass key. She sat on the floor of the broken wagon, the corporal's letter in her lap, the rusted strongbox at her side. The setting sun cast long shadows across the plains, and a chill was beginning to settle in the air. For 3 years, she had carried the weight of her father's perceived failure. Now, she held the weight of his vindication. The truth was heavier than she could have imagined. Her anger was a cold, hard stone in her gut, but it gave her strength. She took the small brass key from the back of the letter. It felt warm in her palm. With a steady hand, she inserted it into the lock of the strongbox. The mechanism was stiff with rust and disuse. She had to wiggle the key, applying gentle but firm pressure, until, With a grating click, the lock turned. She lifted the heavy lid. Inside, the contents were perfectly preserved. On top lay 2 leather-bound ledgers. She opened the first one. The top of the page read, Official Payroll Ledger, Fort Fetterman Garrison, August 1874. Below were columns of names and figures, and at the bottom, the clear, authoritative signature of Captain Marcus Thorne. She opened the second ledger. It was a cruder copy, the handwriting slightly different. The figures altered. It was designed to show a smaller amount, a version of the truth that could be plausibly lost. Beneath the ledgers lay the payload itself, or what was left of it, a few stacks of bundled banknotes and a small handful of gold coins. It was a fraction of the total, likely what Corporal Vance had managed to secret away before hiding the box. It wasn't a fortune, but it was more money than Emma had seen in her life. As dusk deepened, a figure approached, walking with the quiet, ground-covering stride of a man at home in the wilderness. It was Peter Hollis. He had circled back, perhaps out of curiosity, perhaps out of a flicker of concern for the young woman who had bought the cursed wagon. He carried a canteen and a small bundle. "Figured you might be thirsty," he said, his voice as quiet as his footsteps. He held out the canteen. Emma took it and drank, the cool water a balm to her dry throat. His eyes took in the scene without judgment, the open floorboard, the oilcloth, the open strongbox, the letter in her hand. He did not ask what she had found. He simply waited. His quiet presence was an invitation, a space she could fill with the truth if she chose. She did not show him Corporal Vance's letter that was too personal, too raw. Instead, she handed him the 2 ledgers. "My father didn't lose that shipment," she said, her voice devoid of emotion, a simple statement of fact. "It was stolen. By Captain Thorne and Silas Croft." Peter took the ledgers. He was a scout, a man who lived by observation, who understood trails and signs and the deceptions men practiced. He compared the 2 books, his thumb running over the different signatures, his keen eyes noting the discrepancies. He looked from the ledgers to Emma, and in his gaze she saw not pity, but belief. He nodded slowly. "I never figured John Mercer for a fool or a thief," he said. It was the highest praise he could offer. He looked at the broken wagon, his eyes reassessing it. It was no longer a pile of scrap. It was a crime scene. It was evidence. "We need to move it," he said, his voice decisive. "But not like this. We need to make it whole again. We can't have them saying we tampered with it." In that moment, he was no longer a stranger. He was her first and only ally. The work began the next morning at dawn. Peter arrived not with questions, but with tools, a heavy jack, a set of wood chisels, a draw knife with a well-worn handle, and a length of seasoned hickory he'd procured from the fort's quartermaster, claiming it was for a new axe handle. "This will do for the axle," he said, laying the piece of wood on the ground. "It's been drying for 2 years, strong as iron." Emma, in turn, had laid out her father's tools, the few she'd managed to keep. A spoke shave, a mallet, a small hand saw. Together, they began the slow, methodical process of resurrecting the wagon. Their communication was sparse, a language of gestures and shared understanding. He would point to a split tenon. She would know exactly how to clean it and prepare it for a new peg. She would indicate the angle needed for a cut. He would make it with clean, efficient strokes. They were 2 people fluent in the grammar of wood and iron. First, they jacked up the rear of the wagon, lifting the immense weight off the shattered wheel. They carefully removed the broken axle, its wood dark and soft with rot, where the crack had let in moisture. Using the old axle as a template, they began to shape the new one from the length of hickory. Peter did the rough work with a small axe, hewing the wood to the approximate shape, while Emma followed with the draw knife and spoke shave, her movements precise and economical, shaving off fine curls of wood until the new axle was a perfect replica of the old one's sound half. Her father had taught her that the strength of an axle was in its grain, and she followed it unerringly. While she finished the shaping, Peter turned his attention to the broken wheel. He dismantled it piece by piece, laying out the spokes and felloes, the curved sections of the rim, like the bones of some great animal. Several spokes were shattered beyond repair, and two of the felloes were split. "There's a wheelwright in town," Peter said. "Schmidt, he's an old German, keeps to himself, but he has a stock of seasoned oak." They spent the afternoon in the dusty, cavernous workshop of Jakob Schmidt, a man with a face like a weathered map of the Rhine. He watched Emma run her hand over a stack of oak blanks, testing their weight and grain. He saw the way she held a spoke, sighting down its length for imperfections. He grunted, a sound of gruff approval. "You know the wood," he said. He did not ask about the wagon or her father. He simply saw her competence. He named a fair price for the wood, and when Emma counted out the small amount of coin from Corporal Vance's strongbox, he pushed one of the coins back into her palm. "For luck," he said. Back at the wagon, they fitted the new spokes and felloes into the wheel, their mallets striking a steady rhythm. The final, most difficult task was resetting the iron tire. It had to be heated in a fire until it expanded, slipped over the wooden wheel, and then doused with water so that it would shrink and bind the entire structure together with immense force. Peter built a circular fire, and they laid the heavy iron hoop in the coals. As the iron began to glow a dull cherry red, a woman approached, carrying a covered pot. It was Mrs. Albright, the wife of another freighter who had known John Mercer for years. She had seen them working from her small house nearby. "You two have been at it since sun-up," she said, her voice warm. "You need to eat." She set down the pot, which smelled of rich beef stew, along with 2 spoons and a loaf of fresh bread. "My John always said your father was the best teamster on the plains," she added quietly, before turning and walking away. Emma and Peter ate in silence as the sun began to set, the heat from the fire warming their faces. The simple, unspoken acts of generosity from the old blacksmith and the freighter's wife were like mortar, sealing the cracks in Emma's solitary world. The community was beginning to remember John Mercer not for how his life ended, but for how he had lived it. With the iron tire glowing in the twilight, they used long tongs to lift it from the fire. The heat was immense, a physical force that pushed them back. Working quickly, they positioned the red-hot hoop over the newly rebuilt wheel and, with heavy mallets, hammered it down into place. The smell of scorching oak filled the air. "Now!" Peter yelled, and they began dousing it with buckets of water. The hissing was explosive, a great cloud of steam erupting into the cooling air. As the iron contracted, it groaned and creaked, pulling the entire wheel into an incredibly tight, solid unit. It was whole again. They let it cool completely before greasing the new axle and fitting the repaired wheel. It spun true, silent and strong. The wagon still looked like a wreck. The canvas was still in tatters, the sideboards still bleached and scarred, but it stood level on 4 sound wheels. It was no longer a ruin, it was mobile. It was evidence that could be moved. The next morning, Peter arrived with 2 of the fort's draft horses. He hitched them to the wagon's tongue, which they had temporarily splinted. Emma climbed onto the driver's seat, the place where her father had spent so much of his life. She gathered the reins in her hands, the familiar feel of the leather, a steadying presence. With a quiet command from Peter and a click of the reins from Emma, the wagon lurched forward. It rolled. The wheels turned smoothly, the new axle holding firm. They towed it slowly and deliberately away from the auction grounds and toward the fort's main gate, a slow, public procession. Men stopped their work to watch. Soldiers on the stockade walls paused their patrols. The wagon, a ghost for 3 years, was moving again, pulled from its grave. Its journey through the center of the fort was a silent accusation. Peter and Emma brought it to a stop directly in front of the post commander's headquarters. Colonel Davies was a career officer, a man known for his rigid adherence to protocol and his intolerance for corruption. He came out onto the porch, his face a mask of stern inquiry, drawn by the commotion. "What is the meaning of this, Hollis?" he demanded. Peter stood at attention. "Colonel, this is Emma Mercer, daughter of John Mercer. And this is his wagon from the Grayback Creek convoy." Emma stepped down from the driver's seat. She held the oilcloth packet in her hands. With a composure that belied the tremor in her soul, she walked up the steps to the commander. "Colonel Davies," she began, her voice clear and steady. "I have evidence regarding the loss of the Fetterman payroll 3 years ago. Evidence that my father was innocent." She laid it all out for him, right there on the porch. She gave him Corporal Vance's letter, the 2 ledgers, and the official dispatches proving Thorne had ordered the unauthorized detour. She told the story plainly, without embellishment, her words falling into the stunned silence. Colonel Davies read the letter from Corporal Vance, his face growing harder with every line. He examined the ledgers, his trained eye immediately catching the forgery. He looked at the official dispatch, then at Emma, then at the wagon. He saw the truth. He turned to his aide. "Place Captain Thorne under immediate arrest. Send a detachment to bring in the civilian, Silas Croft. I want them both in the stockade within the hour." The order was like a thunderclap. Within minutes, the fort was alive with purposeful movement. The news spread like wildfire, through the barracks, across the parade ground, and into the town. Emma Mercer hadn't just cleared her father's name. She had unearthed a conspiracy that reached into the heart of the fort itself. The dilapidated wagon, which she had bought for $2, now stood as a monument to her unyielding fight for the truth, forcing a town and an army to confront the lie they had been content to live with. In the months that followed, the world shifted back into alignment. A formal military inquiry, presented with the irrefutable evidence from the wagon, convicted Captain Thorne of theft, murder, and conduct unbecoming an officer. He was stripped of his rank and sentenced to life at the military prison at Leavenworth. Silas Croft, tried in a civilian court, was found guilty of conspiracy and accessory to murder. His assets, including the freight office he had stolen from her father's legacy, were seized. As a matter of justice and restitution, Colonel Davies awarded the Army's standing freight contract for the Laramie-Fetterman line to Emma Mercer. It was her father's old route. People in the town and at the fort began to look at her differently. They no longer saw the daughter of a disgraced man. They saw a woman of immense fortitude, a woman who had single-handedly righted a terrible wrong. Teamsters who had once avoided her gaze now tipped their hats. Merchants who had refused her father credit now sought her business. She had earned her place not through inheritance, but through labor and courage. She ran her freight line with the same quiet competence her father had, her name becoming as synonymous with reliability as his had once been. She hired a few good men, bought a string of strong mules, and her wagons became a familiar, welcome sight on the high plains. She did not sell the Grayback Creek wagon. She moved it to the small plot of land she bought on the edge of town, the land where she built her own small office and corrals. She replaced the rotted floorboards, patched the side panels, and stretched a new, tight canvas over its hoops. It was not for hauling freight. It became her sanctuary, a quiet place to do her paperwork, a shelter from the prairie wind. One cool evening, as the last light of the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, Emma stood inside the restored wagon. The air smelled of new canvas and old wood, a scent of endings and beginnings. From a wooden peg on the wall, she took down her father's mule harness. She ran her hand over the supple leather and polished the heavy brass buckles until they shone like gold in the lantern light. She hung it carefully on a hook inside the wagon. Then, she opened a small wooden chest where she kept her most precious possessions. From it, she took Corporal Elias Vance's letter and the small, tarnished brass key to the strongbox. She placed the key on a small shelf she had built just below the harness. The two objects, the harness from the man who had taught her everything, and the key from the man whose final act had saved his name, rested together. They were talismans from two strangers to each other, bound together by an act of injustice, and, finally, an act of truth. Peter Hollis walked up to the open back of the wagon, holding 2 tin cups of coffee. He didn't speak of the past, of the trial, or of the dramatic changes in her life. He just handed her a cup. "Saw your lead wagon pull in," he said. "Looked like a heavy run." "It was," she said, taking the cup. "But the roads are good." They stood there together in the quiet twilight, a comfortable silence between them built on shared work and unspoken trust. Emma looked out from the shelter of the wagon, across the vast, darkening landscape that had once seemed so hostile and was now her home. Emma Mercer was 25 and had been left with nothing but a dead man's shame. She paid $2 for a rotted freight wagon that everyone else saw as worthless. It was the best $2 she ever spent.